In the flickering glow of candlelight, a medieval tavern comes alive not just with laughter and song, but with secrets, schemes, and whispers that stretch long into the night. Here, every mug raised, every shadow cast, and every story told carries weight, shaping the lives, reputations, and alliances of those within. From daring feats and clandestine plots to quiet confidences and midnight revelry, the hall pulses with a hidden energy where humor, danger, and human desire collide. Step inside, and you are drawn into a world where the mundane and the extraordinary entwine, where every glance, every gesture, and every whispered word could reveal a tale, a warning, or a mystery. The tavern waits its doors open, its hearth warm, its stories ready to unfold. As the sun dipped below the thatched rooftops in the year 1347, the village of Dunwich in Suffolk began to shift from the labor of the day to the quieter rhythms of evening. Fields, plowed and sown by the rising generation of peasants, had been abandoned as the last shafts of light faded across the uneven earth. Blacksmiths hammered at the gates and tools, their muscles straining in the final moments before dusk. Carpenters in small workshops swept shavings from oak and elm floors, while apprentices carried the last bundles of timber inside. Women emerged from cottages with vessels of water, settling into the routine of evening chores, washing, mending, and tending to the few animals that remained outside. Smoke rose from chimneys, mingling with the smell of damp earth, and the faint tang of salt from the nearby coast drifted through narrow lanes. In every village across England and the broader continent, one building drew the evening crowd like a magnet: the tavern. At Dunwich, the structure was a timber-framed hall, its walls darkened by centuries of smoke and soot, the heavy beams sagging slightly in the center. The roof, thatched with reeds, rustled as the wind brushed across it, and narrow windows glimmered with the faint flicker of oil lamps. The uneven stone and dirt floor bore the marks of generations of travelers and villagers alike, ruts and pits carved by horses, carts, and the boots of those who had passed before. The hearth at the center dominated the main room, a pit of glowing embers that cast long shadows and filled the hall with the sharp scent of burning wood and charred meat. As the early night drew closer, villagers began to gather. Laborers set aside their shovels and tools, leaning against posts as they shared news from neighboring settlements, or the briefest rumor of tax levies from the local lord in Norwich. Traders brought small packages of fabric, salted fish, or coarse pottery, hoping to sell before the night ended, while itinerant craftsmen displayed their wares and offered demonstrations of skill. In the corners, children skulked with the curiosity of youth, watching the older patrons, learning the patterns of social exchange that would one day define their own adulthood. The tavern was more than a place to drink. It functioned as the village's social nucleus. News from distant markets arrived here first, carried by the rare traveler or merchant passing through. Messages from the Lord's steward, notices of upcoming feasts or punishments, and word of disputes over land or livestock were all discussed openly among those who were willing to listen. Gossip spread with as much speed as the ale, and disputes were often settled informally through conversation, threats, or demonstrations of strength. Ale and bread were rarely enough to keep the patrons satisfied. Information, influence, and alliances were the true currency of the evening. By the hour of vespers, the tavern's interior had filled with the low murmur of voices and the clatter of wooden mugs. Smoke from the hearth hung thick in the rafters, mixing with the aromas of roasting meats, fermented grains, and a faint tang of herbs used in small potions or simple remedies. The hostler, known in local records as Edmund of Dunwich, patrolled the room, calling out debts and monitoring behavior. His authority was recognized both by the villagers who depended on his ale and shelter, and by the occasional passing knight or merchant who might find themselves compelled to respect local custom. Alewives carried trays of foaming ale and bread, their hands steady despite the bustle, wary of the occasional disorderly patron who could turn a cheerful evening into a brawl. Outside, the last colors of sunset bled into the sky, the village church bell tolling faintly in the distance, marking the slow passage from day to night. Inside, candles flickered in iron sconces, illuminating the rough-hewn faces of men and women who had labored for sunup and would rise again before the dawn. The tavern, both hearth and hall, had become a gathering place for the community, a place where the rhythm of daily work gave way to the subtler, often unpredictable currents of human interaction, gossip, and negotiation, and where the night's events, both mundane and extraordinary, would unfold in ways that were never entirely predictable. By the year 1347, the role of a tavern keeper, or hosteler, had expanded far beyond serving ale and bread. In Dunwich, Edmund of Dunwich presided over his establishment with a mixture of authority and practicality that was expected of any licensed inn or alehouse in 14th century England. His responsibilities extended from monitoring the behavior of rowdy patrons to ensuring the accuracy of accounts, managing debts, and reporting to the Lord Steward when required. Licensing laws were strict, and the Crown had mandated that tavern keepers collect taxes on every measure of ale sold, a practice intended to supplement both local and royal revenues. Failure to comply could result in fines, the revocation of the license, or, in extreme cases, imprisonment, a warning that kept many hostelers cautious and vigilant. Within the tavern, the hosteler was the central figure in maintaining order. Edmund patrolled the hall with a wary eye, noting disputes over seating, unrecorded debts, and strangers whose intentions were unclear. He knew that the presence of traveling merchants or wandering knights could shift the balance of authority. A man with coin could command influence that a lifelong villager could not. Conversely, a single insult to the wrong patron could ignite violence, and it was often the keeper's responsibility to prevent escalation, or, at minimum, to witness the confrontation with an official record in mind, preparing to answer to the local lord if required. Assisting him were alewives and serving girls, whose labor was indispensable. Margaret, one of the elder alewives, carried foaming mugs across the uneven floor, moving through smoke and the occasional flying scrap of food with practiced ease. Their work was physically demanding, but they also navigated a social hierarchy that required constant vigilance. They had to manage the desires of patrons while defending themselves against unwanted attention, a task that could be perilous in the hours after dusk. Records from nearby Norwich note that alewives were frequently threatened or assaulted, a risk heightened when the tavern hosted travelers unfamiliar with local norms or rowdy soldiers returning from campaigns. The physical space of the tavern reflected these functions. Behind the bar, a ledger recorded accounts, debts, and the occasional dispute. Wooden partitions separated areas for local villagers from spaces reserved for travelers or the better off, allowing the keeper to control interactions and, if necessary, isolate troublemakers. The hearth was central not only for warmth, but for cooking simple meals, brewing ale, and offering a focal point around which patrons gathered. The uneven floors and timber beams, worn smooth in some areas and splintered in others, served as reminders of generations who had passed through, often in states of exhaustion or intoxication, leaving behind the occasional mark or scratch still visible decades later. Licensing and tax collection placed the tavern under the scrutiny of both secular and ecclesiastical authorities. The local lord expected regular reports of income, lists of guests, and any disturbances that might suggest disloyalty or disorder. Meanwhile, the Crown, through agents and periodic inspections, ensured that alehouses did not become centers of dissent or illegal trade. Keeping a tavern running smoothly meant balancing these competing demands while also maintaining profit margins sufficient to survive winters, when travel slowed and patrons were fewer, and when storms or disease could empty the tavern for weeks at a time. Tension between locals and strangers was a constant concern. Travelers seeking shelter or ale were often viewed with suspicion. A wandering monk or merchant could be carrying news that unsettled villagers, or worse, rumor of taxes, military levies, or plague. Edmund knew that the safety of his establishment relied as much on careful observation and enforcement as on hospitality. Patrons recognized his authority, and his word could settle disputes that might otherwise escalate into violence. Yet the constant negotiation of control meant that no two nights were ever the same. Even as candles were lit and the shadows deepened across the timber beams, the tavern remained a place of order within disorder, a managed chaos in which authority, service, and vigilance intersected. The hostelers' presence, the careful movement of alewives, and the observant eyes of senior villagers created a framework that allowed the village to gather, exchange news, and conduct trade, all while contained within the smoky, uneven walls that had seen generations of nightly gatherings, each visitor leaving a subtle mark on the ongoing life of the tavern. The first clink of mugs and the warm aroma of fermenting grains announced the arrival of night in the year 1347, drawing villagers toward the familiar glow of the tavern hearth. Brewing in the 14th century was both an art and a necessity, and taverns served as much more than social hubs. They were repositories of local sustenance and rudimentary medicine. Ale, made from barley and malt, formed the staple drink for villagers, while mead, a fermented honey beverage, was favored on special occasions. Cider appeared in regions with abundant apple orchards, and imported wines, often from France or the Rhine Valley, reached the tables of wealthier patrons, sometimes served alongside potages or salted meats. Travelers brought exotic spices or dried herbs, introducing new flavors and methods that influenced local brewing practices, making the tavern a center of culinary and alcoholic experimentation. In towns like Ipswich and Norwich, tavern keepers recorded arrivals of foreign wines in ledgers, noting cost and quality for future reference. The process of brewing was labor-intensive. Barley was first soaked, germinated, and dried to produce malt, which was then boiled with water and occasionally herbs for flavor. Fermentation relied on wild yeasts, a method that made each batch unpredictable. Storage occurred in wooden barrels, often kept in cool, dark corners of the tavern or in separate cellars. Records from York in the 1350s note that improper fermentation frequently caused bouts of sickness, and in 1349, a poorly brewed batch of ale reportedly poisoned more than a dozen villagers, highlighting the dangers inherent in the craft. Taverns had to balance quantity and quality, as a hosteler depended on keeping patrons satisfied and healthy enough to return. Apprentices or family members often assisted, learning both recipes and timing needed to prevent spoilage. Taverns also functioned as informal pharmacies. Bitters, herbal infusions, and spiced wines were offered to treat ailments ranging from indigestion to fever. Sage, thyme, and wormwood were common additives, and alewives prided themselves on knowing which herbs could calm a cough or strengthen the constitution. While efficacy varied, patrons relied heavily on them, especially in winter months, when professional physicians were scarce or costly. Brewing and medicine intersected in ways that blurred lines between nourishment and treatment. Ale or mead was sometimes infused with anise, fennel, or other botanicals to ease pain or encourage sleep. Vinegar and honey mixtures were served as a digestive aid, a practice documented in household records from Suffolk. The distinction between beverages was significant. Ale, weaker than modern beer, could be consumed in large quantities without immediate intoxication. Stronger meads and wines were reserved for celebratory gatherings or visiting nobility. Tavern ledgers from Ipswich in 1346 show that a single measure of imported wine could cost more than a day's wage for a laborer, reinforcing social hierarchies. Patrons adjusted drinking habits accordingly, sometimes blending weaker and stronger drinks to extend warmth and cheer. Merchants traveling from city to city often shared new recipes, spreading both innovation and risk. Taverns became informal centers for experimentation, where brewing techniques were tested and information passed along trade routes. Yet not all beverages were safe. Contamination from spoiled ingredients or unclean barrels was common. In Norwich, chroniclers report that a batch of mead infected with mold caused a local outbreak of dysentery in 1351, leaving several villagers bedridden. Tavern keepers developed practical skills for detecting spoilage, relying on taste, smell, and visual cues. Patrons might also unknowingly consume concoctions laced with herbs capable of mild hallucinations or fainting, and these incidents were recorded in parish registers to guide future keepers. Some hostelers kept separate casks for medicinal brews, clearly marked to avoid accidental consumption. By nightfall, the tavern was alive with the scents of malt, honey, and herbs, and the hall rang with conversation and laughter. The tavern's role as provider of sustenance and relief, whether for hunger, thirst, or minor ailments, cemented its place at the heart of medieval village life, drawing peasants, travelers, and local notables under a smoky roof where ale, mead, and potions flowed in equal measure, sustaining bodies and shaping the rhythms of nocturnal social life. The hall remained a center of knowledge, trade, and innovation, where practical skill met social necessity, ensuring each evening continued the delicate balance between nourishment, medicine, and communal gathering. The first notes of a lute, accompanied by the droning hum of a hurdy-gurdy, marked the onset of night in the year 1347, drawing villagers toward the tavern's smoky hearth where warmth, ale, and music awaited. In medieval taverns, music served as both entertainment and a vessel for news, gossip, and social cohesion. Minstrels, jongleurs, and wandering musicians traveled from village to village, offering performances that ranged from bawdy, humorous verses to moralistic ballads warning of the consequences of dishonesty, greed, or drunkenness. Their instruments, lutes, fiddles, bagpipes, and simple percussion filled uneven, timber-beamed halls with sound, carrying both amusement and information to listeners gathered around the fire. The tavern became a stage where peasants, merchants, and travelers intersected, and melodies lingered in memory long after the night ended. Patrons depended on these performances not only for amusement, but also to remain informed about local and distant events, and the songs themselves sometimes carried subtle warnings or advice that could affect behavior long after the evening had passed. Minstrels were more than entertainers. They were chroniclers and messengers. In 14th century England, jongleurs recounted stories of the 100 Years' War, outbreaks of plague, or local disputes, sometimes shaping details to influence opinion. Chronicles from York in 1348 note a minstrel performing a ballad on the siege of Calais, leaving villagers entertained yet unsettled. Music could also function as coded communication. Certain refrains indicated allegiance to factions or warned of impending royal decrees. Taverns provided ideal venues, as warm, crowded spaces allowed musicians to gauge audience reactions and adjust their repertoire accordingly. Observant villagers sometimes picked up subtle cues, spreading news or rumors beyond the tavern walls, and traveling merchants occasionally carried these melodies to neighboring towns, extending both entertainment and information along trade routes. The instruments themselves shaped both tone and energy. Lutes produced delicate melodic sounds suitable for storytelling or quiet conversation, while bagpipes and hurdy-gurdies projected bold tones that inspired dancing or overpowered rowdy patrons. Percussion, including small drums and wooden clappers, kept rhythm for communal dances or games. Ipswich records from 1352 describe a traveling piper who led villagers in a circle dance, during which mugs of ale clinked and patrons jostled one another in friendly rivalry. Music encouraged physical engagement, blurring the line between entertainment and social participation, sometimes escalating minor disputes into loud arguments. In some cases, improvisation by musicians transformed ordinary evenings into extended celebrations, with villagers singing along to new verses or inventing dances to match unusual rhythms. Songs ranged widely in theme. Bawdy verses recounted illicit affairs, local gossip, or crude humor, eliciting laughter but occasionally sparking tension. Moralistic ballads reinforced community norms, portraying consequences for misbehavior and reminding listeners of expected conduct. Tavern keepers relied on music to manage the mood. Spirited songs kept patrons engaged, while cautionary tales reminded them of limits. A poorly chosen song could provoke conflict, making the skill of reading the room essential for performers seeking to maintain both order and enjoyment. In Norwich, in 1349, one record notes that a minstrel's performance of a love ballad inspired both flirtation and quarrels, illustrating music's social power. Some performers even used melodies to encourage peaceful resolution of disputes, embedding subtle cues to calm tempers or foster cooperation among rival patrons. Music also affected drinking. Faster, louder tunes prompted quicker consumption of ale or mead, while slower melodies accompanied reflective sips or quiet conversation. Patrons often joined in chorus, clapping hands or stamping feet in rhythm, reinforcing camaraderie. Musicians frequently improvised songs in response to local events, such as stolen horses, arriving merchants, or village disputes, spreading both news and commentary throughout the hall. On certain festival nights, extended performances lasted until midnight, turning the tavern into a site of communal endurance, where exhaustion mingled with laughter and shared stories. The tavern's architecture supported these performances. The central hearth radiated warmth, while timber beams and uneven floors helped project sound. Small nooks and partitions allowed semi-private conversation or games while keeping patrons close to the music. The loft, when present, often accommodated extra listeners or additional performers, creating layered sound that amplified the hall's liveliness. Together, instruments, song, and design created an immersive environment where entertainment, communication, and social regulation intersected, cementing the tavern's role as a central hub of medieval village life, where news, culture, and communal activity flowed as naturally as the ale. The clatter of dice and the murmur of low voices filled the tavern as dusk settled over the village in the year 1347, drawing peasants, laborers, and tradesmen toward the lower tables where games, gossip, and debates unfolded. These tables were the heartbeat of the tavern, a place where the humblest villagers could gather, share news, and escape the labor of fields and workshops. Unlike the upper areas reserved for wealthier patrons or travelers, the lower tables offered a space dominated by familiarity, where social hierarchies were relaxed and humor, bravado, and competition took center stage. The uneven boards bore the marks of countless elbows, mugs, and the occasional flying coin, each groove and stain a testament to nights of human activity, and the walls themselves seemed to echo with laughter, grumbling, and the occasional curse as games grew heated. Games were central to the nightly rhythm. Knucklebones, early forms of dice, and rudimentary cards provided entertainment and frequently wagers. Villagers staked pennies, scraps of cloth, or even a chicken in spirited contests, turning trivial games into serious business. Chroniclers in Norwich note that in 1348, a heated dice game resulted in a minor brawl, demonstrating how quickly leisure could shift into conflict. The lower tables were also sites of storytelling and debate, where tales of local misdeeds, hunting exploits, or personal grievances circulated freely. Villagers often exchanged advice, bragged of small victories, or shared rumors of tax increases and troop movements, blending amusement with practical concerns. In the crowded tavern, voices rose and fell with the ebb and flow of ale, sometimes fostering laughter, sometimes sparking disputes that required intervention from the hosteler. Drinking rituals intertwined with gameplay, ale and mead flowed continuously, often in large mugs that left patrons spilling over the edges, creating slick patches on the worn floors. Observers from above noted that the lower tables were sites of boisterous drinking culture, where camaraderie mixed with challenge and occasional intimidation. Villagers performed informal tests of endurance, drinking contests that measured both fortitude and tolerance. Historical accounts from Suffolk in the 1,350 seconds describe a night when 4 men, in a wager, consumed nearly 2 gallons of ale each, collapsing into laughter and groans as the tavern watched. The hosteler carefully noting debts and behavior in his ledger. Occasional singing and shouting accompanied these displays, creating a lively and often overwhelming atmosphere for anyone passing through. Fights and brawls were an expected feature. With law enforcement scarce and parish constables slow to intervene, physical confrontation became a form of social regulation. A pushed elbow, a shouted insult, or a disputed wager could escalate rapidly, and the lower tables were where such tensions most often surfaced. In Ipswich, records from 1349 recount a tavern fight over a game of knucklebones that resulted in a broken chair, a severed ear, and several bruised egos, reminding villagers that even in play, social rules and personal pride carried weight. These incidents were rarely fatal, but left lasting impressions and reinforced the tacit codes of conduct among patrons. Yet the lower tables were not only spaces of conflict, they fostered alliances, gossip networks, and informal communication. News of taxes, harvest yields, and royal decrees often reached villagers first through these tables, as traveling laborers and merchants shared information in hushed tones. The tavern provided a rare opportunity for commoners to negotiate disputes, plan work, or simply enjoy a sense of collective belonging. Its smoky halls offered a stage where laborers could exert agency, test skill, and maintain social bonds, even amid the chaos of late-night revelry. Children or apprentices sometimes observed from corners, learning the subtleties of negotiation, betting, and social maneuvering. By nightfall, the lower tables buzzed with activity, a mix of games, drinking, and heated conversation. The combination of competitive play, storytelling, and ale created a lively ecosystem in which villagers exercised both social intelligence and physical endurance. Within the smoky, uneven space of the tavern, the lower tables remained a domain where the village's humblest members carved out their own space for camaraderie, rivalry, and nightly escape, setting the tone for the interactions and conflicts that would unfold in the hours to come, and leaving the hall alive with echoes of the night's exploits long after the last mug was emptied. The soft glow of the tavern's hearth illuminated the arrival of travelers cloaked in leather and chainmail, their presence marking the shift from common revelry to the uneasy mixture of wealth, power, and danger in the year 1347. Nobles, minor knights, and the occasional rogue mercenary often sought shelter and ale in village taverns, moving through smoke-filled rooms with a confidence born of status or reputation. These evenings were defined by negotiation and observation. The tavern became a stage where wealth, privilege, and menace intersected. Patrons of lower status instinctively gave way, while travelers' eyes scanned for both opportunity and threat. The air was thick with the scent of spiced wine, sweat, and wood smoke, and the crackle of the central hearth seemed to underscore the quiet tension as coins changed hands. Deals were whispered, and stories were exchanged with careful calculation. Knights or minor nobles were as likely to discuss recent skirmishes or military campaigns as they were to settle debts or strike deals with merchants and innkeepers. A single purse of coins could shift allegiances, and a threat from a well-armed visitor could quickly silence a rowdy crowd. In London and Canterbury, chroniclers recorded incidents in which traveling soldiers used taverns to recruit laborers for raids or to gather intelligence on local defenses, demonstrating the subtle yet powerful role taverns played in regional power dynamic. A minor noble could demand the best table, the finest drink, or even the services of the alewives, and the tavern keeper had to navigate these demands carefully to maintain profit, avoid confrontation, and preserve the fragile balance of authority within the hall. Observing which patrons were armed, which whispered too loudly, and which gestures signaled aggression became as important as pouring a mug of ale. Outlaws and mercenaries added a more dangerous dimension to the night. They frequented taverns seeking companionship, gossip, or shelter, and their presence introduced both risk and intrigue. Stories from Norwich in 1350 describe a band of highwaymen negotiating the sale of stolen horses near the hearth, while in Ipswich, a traveling knight discreetly resolved a debt with a suspected brigand over a shared jug of mead. Encounters like these required vigilance from both patrons and keepers, as any misstep could escalate into violence, theft, or public embarrassment. Weapons, daggers, short swords, or concealed clubs were never far from reach, and tavern staff learned to read subtle cues in posture, eye movement, and hand gestures that signaled impending danger, sometimes intervening preemptively to prevent bloodshed. Interactions between social classes were a constant negotiation. Common villagers watched with careful attention, noting both risk and reward. Minor disputes could escalate quickly, yet the presence of armed nobles often imposed order by fear rather than law. Wealth could buy influence. A purse of silver might protect a patron from a drunken altercation, secure the best portion of meat, or grant access to a rare imported wine. Conversely, A single insult directed at the wrong traveler could ignite a confrontation that turned the tavern hall into a battlefield. The uneven floors, low beams, and heavy furniture offered both cover and hazard, contributing to the unpredictability of these encounters and requiring patrons to remain alert. Taverns also served as venues for secret meetings. Historical records from Sussex in the 1342 indicate that small groups of knights or mercenaries used the cover of smoke and noise to arrange raids, negotiate ransoms, or broker information about local taxes and troop movements. Backrooms, hidden alcoves, and private benches allowed whispers of intrigue to travel unnoticed. While the public areas continued to bustle with ordinary patrons, the convergence of nobles, outlaws, and villagers created an environment where wealth, power, and deception were constantly measured, and the tavern became a microcosm of the complex hierarchies, shifting loyalties, and dangers of medieval society. By nightfall, the smoke, chatter, and clinking mugs carried on alongside quiet negotiations and covert observation. Patrons learned to navigate the tension, balancing curiosity with caution, while the hostelers' attention never wavered. In these smoky halls, the line between hospitality and danger was thin, and each evening's interactions shaped both the immediate order of the tavern and the subtle currents of influence that extended far beyond its timbered walls, leaving an impression of intrigue, risk, and social negotiation that would linger long after the last mug had been drained. The flicker of candlelight threw long, wavering shadows across the tavern walls in the year 1347, revealing corners where hushed voices and furtive glances spoke of secrets too dangerous to share in the open. These dimly lit spaces, often overlooked by the hosteler and even the bolder patrons, became refuges for whispered deals, clandestine meetings, and quiet plotting. Villagers, travelers, and the occasional outlaw all understood the unspoken rules. Corners were neither entirely safe nor completely exposed, offering a tenuous balance between observation and concealment. What happened here could shape both the evening and the village's unseen currents of influence, extending far beyond the smoky walls and into the alleys and fields that connected this tavern to the wider world. In these shadowed recesses, information flowed as freely as ale. Messengers from neighboring towns, traveling merchants, and wandering soldiers whispered news of tax collections, troop movements, or outbreaks of disease. Villagers seeking advantage in disputes over land, wages, or debts conducted negotiations carefully, aware that a single misstep could provoke violence. Merchants sometimes exchanged coin or goods discreetly, while minor nobles occasionally consulted in secret to broker alliances, settle personal grievances, or arrange favors without drawing attention from common patrons. Even subtle gossip, passed quietly from one shadowed corner to another, could ripple outward, altering reputations or prompting small but consequential shifts in local power. The corners of the tavern became a microcosm of broader society, where knowledge, influence, and subtle power were negotiated in whispers, and where every glance or word could carry weight far beyond the timbered walls. Observation was as important as participation. Those sitting quietly could watch interactions unfold across the hall, gauging allegiances, temperament, and strength. A poorly timed insult, an accidental glance, or the reveal of a secret could turn a quiet conversation into a confrontation. Patrons learned to read body language. A tightened jaw, a shifting stance, or the subtle twitch of a hand could signal impending action. Chroniclers describe these informal lessons as essential to survival. Skillful observers could gain advantage in disputes, predict trouble before it erupted, and even protect themselves or their allies from harm. The vigilant were often those who prospered, quietly negotiating debts, favors, or protection without ever drawing the spotlight. Shadowed corners were particularly valuable to those on the margins of legality. Highwaymen, mercenaries, and petty thieves used these spaces to plan raids, exchange stolen goods, or gather intelligence without drawing notice. Records from Norwich in 1351 recount a minor theft in a village tavern that went undetected for hours, the perpetrator concealed in a dark recess until leaving quietly. Tavern staff, aware of the potential for mischief, developed routines to monitor these areas without disturbing patrons, balancing vigilance with the need to maintain an appearance of hospitality. Occasionally, an observant alewife or serving girl would quietly relay information about suspicious movements to the hosteler, a subtle system of oversight that relied on both perception and discretion. Corners also functioned as neutral ground for negotiation and reconciliation. Feuds could be diffused with whispered apologies, disputed debts renegotiated, and messages delivered discreetly. Travelers and villagers alike relied on these spaces to communicate sensitive information or conduct business in privacy. In some cases, minor nobles even used these areas to confer with allies or emissaries, blending into the shadows to avoid drawing attention from rivals or law enforcement. The interplay of secrecy and openness allowed the tavern to operate as both public hall and hidden forum, reflecting the layered social dynamics of medieval life. By nightfall, shadows deepened, enveloping these hidden spaces in near-complete darkness, while the main hall continued to roar with laughter, music, and argument. The corners remained alive with quiet activity, a subtle, invisible layer of social life that profoundly influenced the village's interactions. In the constant play between light and shadow, visibility and concealment, the tavern functioned as more than a place for drink and cheer. It was an arena where power, knowledge, and survival coexisted. Each corner held its own narrative, capable of shaping events long after the candles burned low, and some whispered decisions even shaped the fortunes of villagers beyond the night itself. The savory scent of roasting meats, simmering pottages, and freshly baked bread heralded the evening in the year 1347, drawing villagers, travelers, and wandering soldiers alike to the tavern's smoky hearth. Food in medieval inns was more than nourishment. It reflected social standing, skill, and negotiation. Heavy wooden tables groaned under the weight of platters heaped with bread, cheese, salted fish, and roasted game. Laborers returning from the fields sought simple sustenance, while merchants and minor nobles expected quantity, quality, and occasionally a touch of extravagance. Kitchens worked tirelessly behind the main hall, cauldrons bubbling over open flames, spits turning over the fire, ovens releasing the warm aroma of freshly baked loaves, while serving girls weaved among the tables carrying plates and mugs, balancing each tray with practiced ease. Occasionally, musicians provided accompaniment, the soft strumming of lutes or tapping of simple percussion mingling with the clatter of dishes and laughter, enhancing the immersive atmosphere. Preparation demanded both experience and coordination. Alewives and kitchen hands juggled multiple tasks, stirring thick pottages, attending spits, baking bread, and ensuring the timing of each dish aligned with the ebb and flow of patrons. Ingredients came primarily from local sources: barley for bread, seasonal vegetables, salted meats, and freshwater fish from nearby rivers and ponds. Records from Norwich in the 1350 seconds note that taverns occasionally purchased game such as venison, rabbit, or fowl from local hunters, supplementing their daily supplies. Presentation mattered. Even simple fare was arranged to appear abundant and appetizing, demonstrating the skill and care of the kitchen staff. The staff also maintained the fires, replenished coals, and ensured that smoke did not overwhelm the hall, a constant balancing act requiring attentiveness and experience. Additional helpers carried extra utensils, refilled water jugs, and prepared herbs and sauces, their work largely invisible, yet essential to the smooth operation of the evening. Distribution reflected hierarchy. Wealthy patrons and visiting nobles received the finest cuts, often accompanied by imported spices, while common villagers were given standard portions. Even among the lower tables, subtle distinctions were evident. Frequent or respected patrons might receive extra servings, while newcomers or debtors waited their turn. Ipswich records from 1348 describe disputes over rationing during times of scarcity, highlighting the careful balance between fairness, custom, and the tavern's authority. How food was allocated was as much a social act as it was practical, with alewives mediating disagreements and observing the unspoken etiquette that governed sharing and portioning. The act of serving itself was ceremonial. Trays were carried in particular orders, special guests acknowledged with gestures, and the timing of dishes carefully orchestrated to maximize both satisfaction and impression. Mealtime was a performance of social cohesion. Sharing bread or dividing pottages reinforced communal bonds, while greed or overconsumption could provoke envy or challenge reputations. Meals often accompanied drinking, games, storytelling, and negotiation, creating a dynamic ecosystem of social and culinary interaction. Special dishes, such as spiced pottages or honeyed cakes, marked festive occasions or honored distinguished guests. Kitchen staff adjusted quantities and timing based on both the number of patrons and the hierarchy present, blending efficiency with the expectations of medieval hospitality. In addition, tavern spaces were occasionally used for informal celebrations, such as christenings, local victories, or seasonal festivals, where the preparation of larger quantities tested both skill and organization. Seasonal changes dictated menus. Winter called for hearty stews and preserved foods, while summer allowed fresh vegetables and herbs to enhance flavor. Taverns sometimes acted as informal markets. Surplus bread, cheese, or ale could be sold or traded, providing income to staff and local suppliers. Alewives and cooks carefully managed spoilage, understanding that tainted or poorly prepared food could provoke illness, dissatisfaction, or reputational damage. The constant attention to hygiene, flavor, and presentation underscored the tavern's role as a center of both nourishment and social expectation. By nightfall, tavern tables overflowed with platters, mugs, and bowls, the combined aromas of roasting meats, baked bread, and simmering pottage filling every corner. Patrons ate, drank, laughed, argued, or whispered deals in shadowed nooks, their appetites and ambitions equally engaged. The tavern became a theater of sustenance, where food reflected not only practical need, but also status, skill, and human desire. Its hearth offered warmth, yet the deeper reward lay in the subtle negotiations and social currents that each meal ignited, shaping village life far beyond the evening supper. The year was 1347, and as twilight settled over the village, the tavern's smoky interior came alive with movement, voices, and the clinking of mugs. Among the chaos, women moved with practiced grace and quiet authority, their presence essential to the rhythm and operation of the hall. Far from being mere spectators, tavern women, whether alewives, serving girls, or the occasional wandering healer, held a unique position in medieval society, balancing labor, social oversight, and subtle influence within a male-dominated space. They managed not only the preparation and service of food and drink, but also the safety, comfort, and entertainment of patrons, negotiating a delicate web of authority, charm, and skill. Their contributions were often invisible to the casual observer, yet they shaped the social and practical landscape of the tavern as decisively as the hearth or the harvest. Alewives occupied the most visible and powerful role. Responsible for brewing and serving ale, they were custodians of both sustenance and social order. Brewing was a craft requiring knowledge of fermentation, hygiene, and timing, and alewives often controlled the supply of drink that fueled much of the tavern's activity. Their judgment extended beyond taste and quality, deciding who received extra measures, moderating disputes, and subtly enforcing rules. They could shape the atmosphere and hierarchy of the hall with a single nod or a withheld jug. Historical accounts from Ipswich in 1348 note alewives intervening in disputes over wagers or seating, asserting authority not through force, but through expertise and presence. In many cases, their reputation alone ensured compliance, as patrons recognized that challenging an alewife could result in denied service or social embarrassment. Serving girls, younger women often apprenticed to alewives or hired seasonally, navigated crowded tables with dexterity and social acuity. They carried trays laden with food, mugs, or jugs of ale, balancing physical labor with a keen awareness of patrons' moods. Observant and quick-witted, they monitored for potential conflict, signaled the alewife when tensions rose, and occasionally facilitated discreet exchanges, gossip, or messages between patrons. Their role required a combination of endurance, speed, and social intelligence, ensuring that even in a chaotic environment, service remained efficient and disputes were minimized. They often became confidantes, messengers, and arbiters in matters small and large, sometimes diffusing tensions before disputes could escalate, and occasionally influencing the outcomes of more serious disagreements. Women also influenced the entertainment and culture of the tavern. Some sang or played instruments, contributing to music that buoyed morale or encouraged conversation. Others advised on games, dances, or the presentation of food and drink, ensuring that performances met the expectations of patrons. Their judgment and taste subtly guided the mood of the evening, shaping interactions among men and women alike. In Norwich, records from 1,350 describe a serving woman helping to calm a quarrel sparked by a card game, using charm, persuasion, and strategic silence to restore order without drawing the attention of higher status visitors. In addition, women sometimes acted as informal educators, passing along news, practical advice, and social norms to younger patrons and apprentices, reinforcing community cohesion. Beyond labor, women navigated the complex social hierarchy of the tavern. They interacted with peasants, merchants, minor nobles, and even outlaws, their status defined as much by skill and reputation as by gender. Patrons learned to respect the authority of women who managed drinks, meals, and disputes, recognizing that their influence could affect both pleasure and safety. In this way, women became linchpins of the tavern's operation, mediating interactions, enforcing unwritten rules, and maintaining the delicate balance between chaos and conviviality. Their presence ensured that the tavern functioned as a place of both sustenance and subtle social negotiation, where information, behavior, and entertainment intertwined seamlessly. By nightfall, women remained central to the life of the tavern, moving between hearth and table, kitchen and hall, negotiating, observing, and serving with quiet authority. Their labor and social intelligence ensured that the tavern functioned not only as a place of nourishment and entertainment, but also as a microcosm of the village itself, a space where skill, influence, and social acumen could alter events, guide behavior, and shape the nightly rhythms of medieval life. They maintained order, encouraged community, and ensured that the tavern's pulse remained steady, a constant amid the smoke, music, and clamor of the evening. When the first torchlight flickered against the timbered walls, signaling the onset of night, the tavern seemed to pulse with life, anticipation, and just a hint of danger. The year was 1347, and the hall was alive with the usual din of conversation, clinking mugs, and the crackle of the central hearth. Yet at the lower tables, where ale flowed freely and wagers were plentiful, tension simmered just beneath the surface, ready to erupt at the slightest provocation. The alehouse brawl was a familiar, almost inevitable, feature of village nights, a chaotic dance of strength, pride, and fleeting anger that revealed the raw undercurrents of social life. Patrons, emboldened by drink and the anonymity of the crowd, navigated a fine line between revelry and violence, while tavern staff worked to contain disorder without extinguishing the energy that drew villagers to these communal halls, ever mindful that one wrong move could turn festivity into calamity. Fights often began over the smallest slights, a disputed roll of knuckle bones, a spilled mug of ale, or a sharp remark could spark an eruption. In Ipswich, in 1348, records recount a single insult exchanged over a card game that escalated into a full melee, leaving chairs broken, mugs shattered, and several patrons nursing bruises. Such confrontations were rarely premeditated. They were spontaneous eruptions fueled by pride, competition, and often alcohol. The unpredictability made the alehouse both exhilarating and dangerous, as every patron was forced to negotiate the boundaries of physical and social risk, while simultaneously keeping an eye on valuables, reputations, and the reactions of more powerful onlookers. The participants varied widely. Laborers and tradesmen tested strength and endurance, while minor nobles or traveling knights could intervene with authority or intimidation. Mercenaries, outlaws, and wandering brigands sometimes joined for sport or gain, turning a petty quarrel into a more perilous affair. Chroniclers note that even seemingly powerless villagers could alter the course of a fight, using agility, cleverness, or environmental advantage to survive or prevail. The tavern's uneven floors, low beams, and crowded tables amplified the chaos, turning a single shove into a cascade of tumbling bodies, shattered objects, and splintered chairs. Broken mugs spilled ale across the floor, sending patrons slipping and shouting, while others leapt into the fray, fists swinging or stools brandished like weapons, and the smell of spilled drink and smoke mingled with the rising tension. Alewives, serving girls, and tavern staff played critical roles. They signaled for restraint, intervened when injuries threatened, and attempted to separate combatants without losing control of the hall. In Norwich, a record from 1351 describes a serving girl who, using her agility and voice, diverted the attention of belligerent patrons, allowing the hosteler to restore order before the brawl escalated further. Their intervention was delicate, balancing authority with diplomacy, as harsh confrontation could inflame tempers rather than calm them. Some even used clever distractions: a dropped tray, a loudly shouted announcement, or a sudden song to break the tension and redirect the crowd's attention, all while ensuring that regulars remained entertained and outsiders wary of misbehavior. Fights were not merely destructive, they were performative. Spectators cheered, jeered, and placed bets on outcomes, creating a charged atmosphere that both reflected and reinforced social hierarchies. Strength, bravery, and cunning earned admiration, while poor judgment or timidity could result in embarrassment. A brawl could elevate the reputation of a clever fighter or humble the overly boastful, reminding all present that respect had to be earned, and that physical skill and quick thinking mattered as much as status or wealth. The alehouse brawl thus functioned as an informal mechanism of social negotiation, testing reputations and asserting personal or group dominance in a way that conversation or coins alone could not. By nightfall, bruises and bruised egos alike served as reminders of the night's intensity. Chairs were mended, floors swept, and ale replenished. But the memory of the clash lingered, shaping interactions long after. The tavern, with its blend of warmth, noise, and occasional violence, stood as a microcosm of medieval village life, a space where leisure, rivalry, and social order collided, and where every evening held the potential for both camaraderie and conflict. In this smoky hall, each brawl was more than chaos. It was a story of pride, skill, and the precarious balance of human temperaments in a world ruled as much by courage as by law. A single spark of candlelight flickered across the tavern walls, and suddenly every eye in the hall was drawn to the hearth, where shadows and whispers promised secrets, gossip, and tales meant to thrill, warn, or amuse. The year was 1347, and as darkness settled over the village, the tavern's smoky interior pulsed with life, the clatter of mugs, footsteps, and murmured conversation giving way to the magnetic pull of storytelling. Patrons huddled near the fire, mugs in hand, while the flickering light painted their faces with both warmth and intrigue. In these moments, when the usual noise softened, tales claimed their place at the center of the hall, shaping both the evening's mood and the subtle social bonds between villagers, travelers, and the occasional wandering minstrel. The tavern became a theater of imagination, memory, and influence, where listeners became co-creators of the narrative, and every story carried weight beyond mere amusement. Even those seated at the farthest corners found themselves drawn into the rhythm, their imaginations painting scenes far beyond the smoky walls, connecting the mundane to the extraordinary, and allowing even the quietest onlooker to feel part of something larger than themselves. The subjects of these stories varied widely. Some recounted the daring deeds of local hunters or soldiers, narrating clever escapes, duels, or miraculous survival in vivid detail. Others were cautionary, warning of deceitful neighbors, unchecked greed, or the perils of pride. Traveling minstrels spun tales of far-off cities, plague, or mythical creatures, blending fact and exaggeration to captivate the crowd. Norwich records from 1349 describe a minstrel recounting the siege of Calais, drawing villagers into vivid visions of smoke, siege engines, and desperate defense, inspiring awe, fear, and admiration. Storytelling, thus, conveyed not only entertainment but subtle moral lessons, reinforcing communal norms and shaping reputations within the tavern walls. Some tales were humorous, drawing loud laughter from the crowd, while others lingered in the mind long after the final words were spoken, serving as warnings or inspiration, and providing a shared cultural touchstone that connected generations. In particularly long evenings, multiple storytellers might take turns, each building upon the last, weaving narratives that blended humor, tragedy, and local lore into a seamless tapestry of village life, and ensuring that no two nights ever felt entirely the same. Alewives and serving girls played an essential role in these performances. They watched audience reactions, encouraged participation, and sometimes nudged storytellers toward brevity. Patrons also contributed tales of personal exploits, gossip, or imaginative fictions that blurred reality with invention. Shadowed corners offered spaces for more private confessions, whispered rumors, or delicate negotiations, ensuring that stories traveled beyond the hall, influencing perceptions, disputes, and reputations long after the night ended. In some cases, these whispers became the origin of village-wide legends or gossip that shaped reputations for years, illustrating the subtle power of narrative in shaping social dynamics. The interplay between public performance and private exchange made the tavern a hub of both entertainment and information, where observation was as valuable as participation, and where the memory of a particularly gripping tale could linger for days in conversations and quiet reflections alike. The physicality of storytelling amplified its effect. Gestures, voice, and pacing drew listeners in, while prop stools, mugs, knives illustrated key moments. Patrons responded with laughter, gasps, or applause, creating a rhythm of shared experience. Tales could calm tempers, provoke quarrels, or spark admiration for clever narrators. In this dynamic environment, skill, wit, and credibility mattered as much as strength or status, and successful storytellers could earn respect, coins, or preferred seating. The interplay of humor, suspense, and moral instruction ensured that each story resonated differently with different listeners, leaving a layered imprint on the collective consciousness of the tavern. By nightfall, the tavern buzzed with layered narrative, heroic feats, moral warnings, gossip, and invented adventures. Each story contributed to the village's living memory, shaping understanding of events, reinforcing social hierarchies, and offering respite from daily labor. In candlelit halls, storytelling became more than entertainment. It was a vessel of community, imagination, and subtle influence. Every tale told, every laugh shared, and every secret whispered strengthened the web of connections that made the tavern a cornerstone of medieval life, where light, shadow, and voice converged to illuminate both human experience and social order. When the church bells had long fallen silent, and moonlight spilled unevenly across the cobblestones, the tavern's doors remained wide open to those unwilling to surrender to sleep, drawn instead by the promise of warmth, drink, and the intoxicating energy of the night. The year was 1347, and as the village slumbered, the tavern pulsed with a different rhythm, one defined by ale, music, daring wagers, and the raw, sometimes dangerous, excitement of midnight revelry. Patrons crowded near the hearth, their faces flushed with drink and laughter, while shadows danced along the walls, lending a hint of theatricality to every gesture. Here, normal rules of the day softened. The night allowed transgression, indulgence, and performance, creating a space where folly and cunning often intertwined in unpredictable ways. Even the most reticent villagers found themselves caught up in the heat of the moment, voices rising in song or story, feet tapping in rhythm, and hands reaching eagerly for another round of ale. Ale flowed freely, dark and foaming in heavy mugs, while bread, cheese, and roasted meats were passed from hand to hand, sustaining both body and bravado. In these hours, common villagers and minor nobles alike shed daytime restraint, testing boundaries of propriety under the watchful eyes of the alewives and serving girls. Records from Ipswich in 1348 described nights when dice games and card matches stretched well past midnight, wagers escalating, tempers flaring, and disputes erupting into spontaneous dances, songs, or brawls. Music, often provided by a traveling minstrel or a local fiddler, served both to energize and to mask the subtler exchanges coin slipping quietly from purses, whispered dares, or the plotting of small mischiefs. Occasionally, traveling performers introduced acrobatic feats or tricks with fire, raising gasps in applause and momentarily suspending the usual rules of conduct in awe and excitement. Revelry could quickly slip into madness. A man emboldened by drink might leap onto a table, challenging a neighbor to feats of strength, or provoke the crowd with a brash insult, the line between entertainment and danger as thin as the candle flames that trembled on the walls. Norwich chronicles from 1349 recount an evening when a heated argument over a mislaid bet escalated into a full-blown chase around the hall, chairs overturned, mugs shattered, and laughter mingling with cries of alarm. The tavern became a stage, the patrons both audience and performers, improvising in a high-stakes drama of pride, daring, and intoxication, where every gesture could spark admiration, envy, or sudden conflict. Women in the tavern remained both observers and participants, guiding the flow of events with subtle gestures and quiet authority. Alewives monitored the pace of drinking, ensuring excess did not spiral into true danger, while serving girls moved among the crowd, redirecting tensions with charm, song, or timely distraction. In Norwich, a record from 1350 notes a serving woman who diverted a near riot by toppling a tray of mugs, prompting startled laughter that cooled tempers, restoring balance with a combination of wit, courage, and precise timing. These interventions highlighted the careful equilibrium required to maintain order while allowing revelry to flourish. By the heart of night, chaos and delight merged into a singular energy. Patrons sang bawdy songs, challenged one another to contests of strength, and spun tales that grew taller with every retelling. Laughter ricocheted off timbered walls, mingling with the aroma of roasted meats and the warmth of the central hearth. Even those watching from shadowed corners could not resist being drawn into the spectacle, caught between amusement, envy, and admiration for the bold or foolish alike. As the first hints of dawn threatened the horizon, the tavern's pulse gradually slowed. Chairs were righted, spilled ale cleaned, and the most daring of the night's antics dissolved into whispered stories and shared memories. Midnight revelry left behind bruises, hangovers, and laughter, echoing long after the last mug was emptied. In these hours, the tavern revealed itself not merely as a place of food or drink, but as a crucible of social dynamics, courage, folly, and cunning, a nightly theater where the human spirit tested boundaries, embraced risk, and celebrated life's fleeting, intoxicating chaos. Even as light crept across the village streets, the echoes of laughter, song, and daring would linger in memory, reminding all who had gathered that the night belonged as much to audacity as it did to ale. When the tavern doors slammed shut against the chill of evening, a shiver of anticipation ran through the hall, as though the warm light and lively chatter could not fully mask the secrets lurking in its shadowed corners. The year was 1347, and alongside the warmth, laughter, and storytelling, the tavern harbored darker currents pockets where crime, cunning, and desperation intersected under flickering candlelight. These were spaces where opportunity met boldness, and where the anonymity of a crowded hall allowed patrons to test boundaries without immediate consequence. Pickpockets, cheats, and petty thieves navigated the tables with practiced stealth, while more audacious figures plotted schemes that reached beyond the tavern's walls, using the hall as both a marketplace and a hiding place for illicit dealings. Even seemingly trivial movements, a diverted glance, a sudden absence, or the careless sway of a mug could conceal intent, keeping the vigilant staff and perceptive patrons constantly alert. The clatter of mugs and laughter often acted as cover, masking the deft motions of hands reaching for coin or pocketed trinkets, making detection a game of observation and intuition. Crimes often began subtly. A coin slipped from a purse, a piece of bread quietly taken from an unattended platter, or a false wager placed during dice games. Norwich records from 1350 recount a traveling merchant whose satchel disappeared while he became engrossed in a tale by a minstrel, illustrating the constant vigilance required in the busy hall. Opportunistic thefts were rarely violent. They relied on timing, observation, and psychological insight. Patrons who learned to read gestures, shifts in posture, or distracted glances could catch perpetrators in the act, turning minor skirmishes into lessons in prudence and awareness. Even small acts, like surreptitious coin swapping or misdirected attention, revealed the subtle skill with which tavern crime was executed, demanding both cunning and patience. In many ways, the tavern functioned as a testing ground for human cleverness, where those who moved too boldly or too timidly were quickly noticed and remembered. More serious plots unfolded in shadowed corners. Disputes over debts, stolen goods, or perceived insults sometimes escalated into coordinated acts of retribution, involving accomplices among the crowd. Mercenaries, wandering outlaws, and skilled rogues exploited the commotion to manipulate situations to their advantage. Ipswich accounts from 1348 describe a gang of thieves who exploited the distraction of a tavern brawl to quietly lift coin purses and valuable trinkets from unsuspecting patrons, disappearing into the night with no immediate consequence. Some criminals leveraged storytelling sessions or raucous drinking as cover, timing their moves precisely when attention was elsewhere. Blurring the line between mischief and premeditation, the tavern became both stage and shield, where mischief and strategy intertwined, and where observation could prove as valuable as audacity, the most perceptive often noticing schemes others missed entirely. Tavern staff were acutely aware of these dangers. Alewives, serving girls, and the hosteler monitored patrons carefully, balancing hospitality with vigilance. Subtle signals, a glance, a cough, a rearranged tray alerted them to potential threats without alarming the crowd. In Norwich, a record from 1351 recounts a serving girl who noticed a heavy purse tucked beneath a chair and quietly intercepted a would-be thief, returning it to its owner. Staff coordination allowed audacious criminals to be tracked discreetly, preventing escalation and preserving the delicate equilibrium of trust that kept patrons returning. The presence of crime influenced social dynamics as much as entertainment or labor. Patrons quickly learned to guard possessions, read intentions, and navigate alliances, understanding that respect and caution were equally valuable. Informal networks formed as neighbors warned one another, while gossip spread rapidly, amplifying reputations and deterring repeat offenders. Crime in the tavern was never purely destructive. It taught vigilance, strategy, and social discernment, reinforcing hierarchies while subtly shaping behavior. By nightfall, the shadows of crime retreated with the closing of doors and the dimming of lamps, leaving only the faint memory of schemes, stolen coin, and narrowly avoided misfortune. The tavern remained a place of warmth and camaraderie, but beneath every laugh and clink of mugs lingered the knowledge that darkness could creep in, challenging both the clever and the unwary, shaping the invisible boundaries that governed medieval village life, and reminding all who entered that caution, wit, and observation were as essential as ale and food, and sometimes just as rewarding. When the tavern lanterns flickered low, and the shadows lengthened across the timbered walls, a quieter, more intimate energy settled over the hall. The year was 1347, and long after the midday crowds had departed and the midnight revelry had waned, a handful of steadfast patrons lingered, drawn by the warmth, conversation, and the lingering scent of roasted meats and ale. These last visitors, laborers who had labored late in the fields, travelers seeking shelter, and the occasional village elder formed the final rhythm of the evening, a slow and reflective cadence that contrasted with the earlier chaos. In these hours, the tavern revealed its subtler side, where conversations deepened, confidences were shared, and the night's earlier exuberance gave way to contemplation and the careful unwinding of social energies. Quiet laughter, soft murmurs, and the occasional clink of a mug became the soundtrack to reflection, while the fire's glow lent warmth to both body and mind. Even the faintest draft through the slightly ajar door seemed to carry a whisper of stories yet untold, blending with the aroma of smoked meats and spent ale. The remaining patrons often gathered near the central hearth, where embers glowed softly, casting a muted light across worn wooden tables. Alewives and serving girls moved more deliberately now, replenishing mugs and plates, quietly attending to lingering needs without the hurried efficiency demanded by crowds. Their presence was a gentle reminder that even as the night drew to a close, the tavern remained a space of vigilance, care, and subtle management. Norwich records from 1350 describe evenings in which the last handful of patrons would gather to recount the day's events, discuss village matters, or exchange information gleaned from travelers, transforming the hall into an informal council of observation and commentary. Occasionally, a patron would linger to discuss news from a distant town, a market dispute, or a recent accident in the fields, giving the alewives the dual role of listener and mediator, their discretion as valued as their skill in serving. Some patrons even lingered to enjoy the quiet music of the dying hearth, or to savor the final tastes of the night, prolonging a moment of calm and connection. Conversations in these hours were measured, often tinged with reflection, humor, or quiet mischief. Minstrels long retired to the corner would offer soft notes of music, while storytellers recounted earlier tales in hushed tones, emphasizing nuance and moral reflection rather than spectacle. Here, narrative served a new purpose, reinforcing community memory, preserving gossip, and subtly instructing listeners in the norms and expectations of village life. Ipswich accounts from 1348 mentioned patrons quietly negotiating debts or promises, sometimes with the alewife acting as mediator, her authority respected even in these smaller private moments. The softer hours allowed for debates, gentle teasing, and quiet camaraderie, as patrons shared personal stories that might never have been spoken aloud in the more crowded, raucous hours. The last patrons also revealed the interplay of trust and hierarchy that underpinned tavern life. Laborers conferred with minor nobles over debts, deals, or favors. Travelers shared news of distant towns, and neighbors exchanged quiet warnings or observations about the week's events. Every interaction, though understated, carried significance. The tavern, even when nearly empty, functioned as a crucible for information, where reputation, vigilance, and prudence remained as vital as any mug of ale. Small gestures, a nod, a lowered voice, a carefully timed sip conveyed meaning, reflecting the layered social rules that governed behavior long after the central fire had cooled. By the approach of dawn, even the last patrons drifted away, leaving the tavern silent, but not empty. Chairs rested where they had been set, mugs and plates cleaned or stacked, embers glowing faintly in the hearth. Alewives and serving girls completed their final tasks, closing doors against the chill of morning, while the memory of the night lingered in both air and mind. The tavern, in its quiet aftermath, revealed that every evening, from the first spark of candlelight to the departure of the last visitor, was a tapestry of energy, mischief, camaraderie, and reflection. It was in these closing hours, where laughter had softened into conversation and chaos had given way to contemplation, that the full rhythm of medieval tavern life could be felt, remembered, and quietly honored, a nightly testament to human connection, resilience, and shared experience, where the quietest moments often carried the deepest impressions. When the first pale fingers of dawn stretched over the thatched roofs and cobblestone streets, the village stirred with a gentle hush, as though reluctant to leave the lingering quiet of night. The year was 1347, and the tavern so alive with clamor, revelry, and whispered secrets hours before, now lay in the delicate light of early morning. Smoke from the hearth curled lazily upward, carrying faint traces of roasted meats, spilled ale, and the lingering warmth of countless bodies. The tavern, which had hosted the full spectrum of human experience through the previous night, now exhaled a calm, reflective energy, bridging the chaos of darkness with the ordered rhythm of the day. Dawn illuminated the timbered walls, the worn wooden beams, and the scattered mugs, revealing a hall that had been both arena and refuge, theater and confessional. Even the faint smell of charred wood and spilled ale seemed to tell the story of hours passed in laughter, conflict, and shared humanity, leaving an invisible imprint upon the hall itself, an enduring memory carried in scent and shadow. The first patrons of morning arrived slowly, feet still heavy from sleep, faces marked by dreams or the hangovers of nocturnal indulgence. Laborers set out to fields, tradesmen unlocked workshops, and traveling merchants prepared for markets, carrying with them remnants of conversation, wagers, and stories overheard in the night. Norwich records from 1349 describe villagers pausing at the tavern door, exchanging brief greetings or last morsels of information before departing, creating a subtle rhythm in which the tavern acted as both a threshold and a hub, a place to collect oneself before stepping fully into daylight labor. In these early hours, the tavern's role shifted from stage and crucible of social dynamics to a space of preparation, reflection, and communal continuity. Occasionally, a patron lingered a few moments longer, lingering over a steaming mug of ale, sharing a final joke or whispered story, ensuring the night's spirit lingered even as daylight advanced, and offering small comfort before the day's labors began. Inside, alewives and serving girls began the meticulous work of cleansing the hall, stacking mugs and plates, stoking the hearth to a gentle glow, and sweeping away the remnants of the previous night. Each gesture was deliberate, a blend of practicality and ritual that restored order while preserving the traces of human activity that had defined the tavern's pulse. Even the smallest details, the careful placement of a chair, the alignment of a wooden bench, or the polishing of a counter, spoke to an unspoken reverence for the rhythms of communal life. Ipswich accounts from 1348 note how careful attention to the hall's appearance signaled stability, respect, and trustworthiness, reassuring returning patrons that the space would remain a reliable anchor of village life. The air, still cool and fragrant with morning dew, carried faint echoes of the night's stories, laughter, and mischief. Patrons who lingered at tables murmured over plans, debts, or gossip, connecting the past night with the approaching day. Minor nobles discussed local matters quietly over a final cup of ale, while laborers shared observations from the previous day's work. In these moments, the tavern functioned as a bridge between the private and communal, the personal and civic, offering a space where the village's social, economic, and cultural threads intertwined seamlessly. Even the quietest exchange, a nod, a lowered gaze, a shared smile contributed to the invisible tapestry of connections that bound the community together. As sunlight strengthened, the village fully awakened, the tavern's doors swung open, and the first noises of daytime labor and trade filled the streets. Inside, the hall had transformed once again, cleansed yet marked by the night's passage, ready to resume its role as gathering place, marketplace, and theater of human experience. Dawn revealed that the tavern was never merely a structure of wood and hearth. It was a living organism, a reflection of the village itself, where energy, caution, wit, and camaraderie flowed in equal measure. From the first spark of candlelight to the quiet moments of sunrise, the tavern had embodied the heart of medieval life, a space of connection, resilience, and ceaseless human rhythm, forever standing as a witness to the ebb and flow of community, human folly, enduring tradition, and the quiet triumphs of everyday life.